Hello, everyone, and welcome to another edition of RAMChat. I am Mike Ongstead, playing host today, but I'm pleased to be joined by our very own Mary Anna Mancuso and Jon Grinspan, the Smithsonian National History Museum curator of political history and also author of the book, The Age of Acrimony, How Americans Fought to Fix Their Democracy, 1865 to 1915. Sure to be a great conversation, especially for those of you who are super nerdy about politics and history, just like Mary Anna, who I know has been dying for this interview for a while. So with that, I'll hand it over to Mary Anna Mancuso and let her start drilling away.
Thank you so much, Mike. This is true. I have been so excited to sit down with you, Jon. Thank you so much. And for those of you wondering, this is his book, The Age of Acrimony. If you have not picked this up, please run and do so after this chat. Don't do it during, maybe after. So welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm so excited to sit down with you today.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for your interest and enthusiasm. I love talking about this stuff.
Awesome. So I just want to question, as I was reading your book, I found it fascinating for a plethora of reasons. But in your book, you talk about the arc of American democracy, and you use the way that you actually tell this story, which I found most fascinating, was through the iconic American father-daughter duo, William Pig Iron Kelly and his daughter, Florence Kelly. Can you share a little bit about them and what made them such a political powerhouse and why you chose to tell the story through their relationship?
Well, one, it was interesting to tell the arc of American democracy through people that almost no one has ever heard of. Some people have heard of Florence Kelly. Some historians have heard of William Pig Iron Kelly, but they're not founding fathers. They're not the kind of people you see on dollar bills or whoever. And we have this narrative of American democracy that it starts in 1776 and it's just a steady on-ramp of expanding rights and liberties and access till some recent period when we get to the modern era and we run into some issues. But I wanted to show the ups and downs of our history, the innovations of our history, and the ways politics and culture intermingle and fundamentally alter each other, the way social life and political life, the way families and big picture democracy and governance kind of tangle up together. And there's this family, Will Kelly, who's a congressman from Philadelphia, and his daughter, Florence Kelly, who becomes a somewhat famous labor reformer. And they live through kind of the formative 100 years from 1830 to 1930 of this era. And they're deeply involved in politics and reform and women's suffrage and abolition. And all along, they're in communication with each other. Will teaches his daughter to engage in politics, to kind of play as big a role as she can, considering she's a woman in an era when she was disenfranchised. And Florrie writes letters to her father arguing about the issues and eventually kind of breaks with him on many key issues. So you can, through this one family, through their letters, their interactions, tell this huge story of the evolution and development of this really tumultuous political system. And they just knew everybody. I mean, you go through their papers in Philadelphia and New York, and you see letters from Abe Lincoln, Frederick Douglass, Teddy Roosevelt, Jane Addams. So you can really connect a lot of dots through this one human story that makes these big statistical questions about turnout and engagement really kind of intimate.
Yeah, no, and it was interesting as you were reading through the story. I felt like I was put back in time, and so it was very well done. And oftentimes we hear people hearken back to the days of noble politics, but dirty tricks in politics like name calling, slander, hostility, it's not new. So is this moment of incivility, division, and acrimony different, or are we just suffering from euphoric recollection?
Well, I guess the easy historian's answer is every moment is different. There's always, everything is unprecedented and has plenty of precedents at the same time, right? History is always new and unfolding. There's no history doesn't repeat itself. It doesn't even rhyme or echo. But we have a really old political system here. We have the longest continuously used constitution in world history. The Democratic Party is basically the oldest political party in the world. The Republican Party is a little bit younger. We really have a useful record here. And I think often we talk about our own era as something unprecedented and disjunctive and scary in many ways. And we do a disservice to ourselves by not looking back at how that political system was used. Not just what were the laws on the books, but how people voted, what kind of behavior they had, how they talked about politics, both in the line to vote and with their families, in the saloon, on the steamboat, and their behavior up and down. And we really have this arc of really intense animated but ugly engagement in the late 19th century. Really common political violence, fraud, intense partisanship and tribalism, and at the same time, really high levels of participation for those who could participate. So, as we try to kind of untie the knot of our own political era, we have all these themes that we can look back through our history and understand a little bit, see something from the 1876 election or the 1884 election that has glimmers of today. And if not offering a direct path to what we should do right now in 2022, at least offers us the solace that we haven't broken our political system. We're just moving through relapses in different eras. And studying our past is really helpful in kind of charting where we are today.
I like that. So 2022 is more of a relapse. That's a nice way to think of it. In reading the book, you talked a lot about how kind of bad it was. I remember reading about how they would carry torches down the street with the name of candidates. And that wasn't nearly as startling as the part where they were strolling down coffins down Main Street, USA, so to speak, with the opposing candidate's name scrawled across the side. And then children lighting celebratory bonfires and them shooting off cannons. I mean, it was just wild how you go into all of that. Now, there was a period that you do talk about. So after we talk about how crazy it was back in that time, crazy because right now it seems crazy, but that just seems bizarre to me. But I'm sure living at the time, it was just, that's how it was. So in 1887 to 1920, America entered what you refer to as the Great Quieting. And it was kind of the beginning of more of like boring politics of sort. Can you share some insight into the impact that this has had on the electorate? And do you think the passage of voting restriction bills across the country is kind of a resurgence of the Great Quieting 2.0, so to speak?
That's such a great question. First of all, you must have read the book really closely, because 1887 is the hidden year that everything turns on, and no timeline of America marks 1887 as that significant. So only weirdos like me and people like you who read the book are pointing to 1887. Yeah, I mean, it's weird in a way because we have both a great quieting and a great shouting at the same time right now. I mean, we have an intensification of turnout, of partisanship, of good and bad. And I should pause to say that the political behavior back then is crazy in ways that we can admire and kind of look down upon, just as we have similar things today. We have increase in political violence, increase in tribalism, all these things, but you also have great turnout, really, really great kind of cultural and social engagement in politics, especially by working class people, young people, people who aren't necessarily in power in other situations. In 19th century politics, they're engaged on the street. They're running campaigns when they aren't running Wall Street or whatever. So we do have things to admire about that era, but there are also things to look down upon. And we do see this era from 1887 on through the 1920s where there's a deliberate effort to calm politics both by changing voting rights and changing voting laws, and also calm the culture of politics. Go from a political system that's deeply public to one that's really private, where you're not supposed to talk about politics at the dinner table. The way, in a different way than 50 years before, you talk about it at the saloon, at the dinner table is really a common issue. After the 1880s and into the 1890s, it becomes more admired to be independent than be partisan. Previously, being a partisan meant you were strong and moral and stuck with your virtues. In the 20th century, being an independent means that you are open-minded and thoughtful and kind of following your own inner compass, as opposed to some party telling you what to do. You see all these changes, and we do see some of them again today. We see some places making it harder to vote, some places making it easier to vote. We see some places amping up political culture and trying to build up a larger, more thorough social democracy, other places making it almost illegal to protest. So we're in this weird era where all these themes from the past are reemerging in different ways, in overlapping ways, which I guess is always how it is. You never get a real repeat of one era in another without new trends. So I think you're exactly right. You do see some of these tendencies to say politics should be quieter. We should calm this down. We really can't live in the system anymore. Civility is at stake. But on the other hand, you see higher turnout in the 2020 election than any since 1900. And some of these behaviors that, I thought were just in the history books and old newspapers being brought back in the 21st century. It's kind of, as a historian, it's been shocking to see things that you thought were long dead or tricks that you thought were long buried because they're pretty harmful being brought back into the political system. It's been a strange time to live in. I guess we can all say that.
Yeah, I would have to agree with that. Absolutely. So we started at 1887, but I want to go back to 1865. And Will Kelly warned in a letter, he said, quote, "These are terrible times for timid people." Do you think that Pig Iron Kelly would make the same comment regarding today's political comment?
Yeah, he says these are terrible times for timid people. And what he means is those who are not, it's a moment at the end of the Civil War of real opportunity and innovation. You can expand voting rights. You can expand citizenship to African Americans. You can remake a nation that is more just to working people. You can, Kelly was a supporter of women's suffrage. You can expand the right to women to vote. In the 1860s, 50 years before, more than 50 years before it happens, Will is calling for it. Sorry, I'm on a first name basis with him at this point. Congressman Kelly is calling for it. And the subsequent era, there's an effort to kind of calm this politics down, make things easier on the timid people. And the 20th century is a good time to be timid, I guess. You can live in this political system where it's not very hard to go vote. No one expects you to talk about your politics. You can be a politician and lead with kind of restraint and a sense of your being decorous and decorum and polite is kind of more important than being bold and aggressive in 20th century history. And you could argue we're living in a time again when it's pretty bad to be timid. I mean, you look at the international sphere or American democracy today, it's more aggressive. There is a sense of more of a zero-sum competition between winners and losers. Now, the sad thing is we don't see much of that sense. They saw in the 1860s and they saw in the progressive era of real flexibility for positive change. So the sense that these terrible times for timid people because we need to make real positive change. I think we feel more stalled today than the 1860s, or more like the 1880s, where nothing good really happened for quite some time. But on the other hand, every stalled period builds a blockage in American history, and that blockage breaks eventually. So the ugliness of the Gilded Age and the sense that real reform is being blocked in the Gilded Age leads to the progressive era. The ugliness of the antebellum era and the growth of the slave power leads to this moment after 1865 of expanding rights. So we might be in one of those block periods, and it might just be a matter of time. I know that sounds easy and kind of fatalistic, before the next period of real significant reform comes. One of the questions is just how long it will take, I think.
Right. And so as a result of that, there's some people currently that are worried that American democracy is standing on the brink of extinction. Do you think that democracy could be extinct in a matter of election cycles?
I think as a historian, I'm really bad at predicting the future, but I think we need to remember that every moment wasn't in a history wasn't inevitable until it happened. And there's a path forward we can see. It's really threatening to democracy, where voters will be overturned by state legislatures, the electoral count will be tampered with, voters will be suppressed on the ground. We can really imagine this ugly future, and it's definitely something we should worry about. And I understand the sense. I live in Washington D.C. I understand the sense of building anxiety before every election, and I can't imagine what it'll feel like in the weeks before 2024, wondering what will happen. But I also think there's a way in this history that you can see how people in a dark era talk themselves into a darker vision of politics. That there's this tendency in the late 19th century to say democracy has failed, it'll never work. And the people who say democracy has failed, it'll never work, never make any positive change. And then there's a rising movement after 1887, people like Teddy Roosevelt, who were much more engaged and optimistic about the reforms that can be made. They spend a lot less time saying, oh, woe is me, it's all going to fail, everyone's corrupt. And they spend a lot more time digging into how to make actual change. And I do think there's a way we can talk ourselves into disaster and say over and over and over again, democracy's dying until it's dead. But none of these are inevitable. None of this is an eventuality. And this might be 10, 20, 50 years, a dark period we look back on as having passed. We have many dark periods in our history that have passed. And there's no reason to assume that this is some final inevitable end. And I think the more we talk about it as inevitable and as unavoidable, the more we make it so. So I think how we talk about democracy, how we talk about reform, and how specific we are about the problems and how to address them, I think is actually in its own way taking a step towards making reform, just not boxing ourselves into the most dire possible situation.
Well, I love your optimism, and I would have to agree. And speaking of elections, I want to pivot and talk about the election. It's a riveting one, Rutherford B. Hayes, and the impact that election had on our democracy. Would you share why this election was so important and sometimes overlooked in our political history?
Yeah, it's an amazing one. And you have two just fundamentally boring candidates having the most exciting election, maybe other than 1860 in our history. Rutherford Hayes is a kind of mild Republican veteran from Ohio. No one is very excited about Rutherford Hayes. Samuel Tilden, his opponent, the Democrat, is a reformer from New York who's kind of strange and retiring and a little bit of a recluse in his own ways. Nobody really loves these guys. But this is an election 15 years after the beginning of the Civil War, when all the changes of the Civil War and Reconstruction era, of African American citizenship and voting rights, of the Confederacy being defeated, of a expanding Republican Party in the North, all the changes of immigration, of issues with money, they all seem on the table. It's in the middle of a depression. Populations who previously hadn't voted that much, like defeated white former Confederates, are coming back into the political system, and you have huge turnout. This is the highest turnout election in American history of any presidential election we've had. Something like 82% of eligible voters go to the polls, and those who can't vote are still arguing and talking the issues. And then after all this work and all this campaigning in the streets, no one knows who won. It's very unclear who won the electoral vote. It's clear the popular vote went to the Democratic candidate, Samuel Tilden, but the electoral count, which is really what matters, is up in the air. And so both parties kind of launched this frantic scramble to get enough votes on these state levels in these states like Louisiana, South Carolina, Florida, and Oregon, which are up for question. And they basically start stealing this election back and forth from each other. One party will throw out the ballots, or the Democratic Party prevented many voters, especially African Americans, from voting. And then as a response, the Republican Party goes out of its way to throw out whole ballot boxes from regions that they thought the vote was not right in. So there's this kind of push and pull. And in the end, the Republican Party, which controlled the presidency, makes a deal and also has greater partisan power and wins the day. The party that lost the popular vote holds on to the presidency. And it's seen as this real turning point. Some people pointed to it as its end of Reconstruction. I think that process is already really ongoing on the ground well before this election. To me, what it really says is you can have huge turnout, you can have great engagement, you can get the American people to do what they're supposed to, which is care and go vote, and the results will be unclear, and ultimately the final decision will basically be crooked. And to Americans in the 1870s, 100 years after the formation of the country and the Declaration of Independence, it says the country they've built is flawed, is declining, is failed, and voting, hope that reform can come through electoral politics is out the window. And it really reframed how people think about democracy for a whole generation. And I think, we're living in 2022. We can see the way that one difficult election like 2020 can have a really long tail after it. And 1876 inflects our democracy long after it's kind of forgotten.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And now in your book, you point out, quote, "If there was ever a bottom to Americans' faith in their own democracy, a low point of confidence in the system, it came in the mid to late 1880s. So given that we see currently 64% of Americans believe United States democracy is, quote, in crisis and is risk of failing in the rise in political violence, is the 1880s still a low, or is this lower now? And do you think the faith in American democracy by Americans was better back then versus now?"
That's a great question. On the one hand, you see more kind of easy patriotism expressed in the 1880s, a kind of Uncle Sam, American flag, love of the founding fathers. I think you probably see a little more cynicism about American history and heritage and patriotism today. But on the other hand, in the 1880s, you see so much more actual corruption, real, not accusations of vote theft, but real open theft on a huge level, not accusations of tampering or violence, but real political violence on a huge level. I mean, this is a time, the 1884 election, it's even after Reconstruction is over, and the parties themselves are still buying handguns at elections to send to different parts of the country in anticipation of violence at the polls. The Republican Party sends 800 British Bulldog pistols to Cincinnati for the election so that they can kind of control the polls there. So in some ways, we have more pessimism. In some ways, we have less. I do think one big difference then and now, or not difference, really one big commonality that's hopeful is generational change. That in the 1880s, you see this period when the Civil War generation is starting to pass from the scene, and you see the slow emergence of a new generation that'll make a lot of reforms. And we might be hopeful about that today too, that the generation that fought over a lot of these issues, they don't look or act much like Gen Z does or some millennials do. And so I think there is, if you find hope for the future, it's that every generation passes on, and every heated political moment will end. And maybe we can hold out some hope for that too.
I love that. So overall, I would say if you have to condense this down, what is it that we can learn from the post-1880s to reinvigorate confidence and faith in American democracy today? Are there any lessons we may have learned then that we should be applying today?
Oh, I'm so bad at lessons. Okay. The easiest, biggest lesson that I'm certain is true is that active movements for reform can remake politics, both in terms of change laws and remake the political culture. That what's really striking about this story is the way reformers who are not happy with the direction of democracy, some for good reasons, some for bad reasons, build a new effort, a really successful movement to reform how people vote, how people talk about politics, how they think about democracy, and our sense of politics, of democracy, of where politics should go, how we should behave, what the rules should be, how we should vote, all these things, how we should treat each other, are built by individuals out of whole cloth in some places. The norms we have of democracy were constructed by people who didn't like the old norms. And I think in 2022, when we're all pretty, only 64% of Americans are unhappy with American democracy. It seems like a low number, but at a period when we're all fairly frustrated with our political system, I think it's really helpful and calming and enlightening to see that you really can make deliberate change. You can make deliberate change for harmful reasons, and you can make deliberate change that really benefits America. And the world we took for granted as normal politics was constructed, and a new normal can be built too. That's probably the biggest, boldest lesson you can take from the story.
Definitely bold, that's for sure. And I think that it is a lot of optimism as well. And we have to be mindful about what are we going to choose, which path, So when we look 200 years from now, I'm not asking you necessarily for projections, but I would love to know what your hope is on the story that will be told about today's political climate. Obviously, as a political curator, you spend a lot of time gathering artifacts and putting things together for the Smithsonian, which we'll talk about in a moment. But what is the story you hope will be told about this moment here today, 200 years from now?
One thing I think about a lot, I'm not sure if this is a hope, it's just something I think about, is the point in history when issues and conflicts stop being heated and bloody and start being just the distant neutral past. That if you go into a museum with ancient objects from ancient history, and there's an Egyptian sword and a Hittite sword next to each other, you don't think these people really at war. You think these were people in the past. They come from basically the same part of the world. At some point, the objects we collect, protest signs from warring organizations, tiki torches from Charlottesville, riot shields, these kinds of things that are really heated and emotional and hurtful for us to look at in some ways, will just seem like the past. And they not that I want any of the negative associations to move away or for us to forget about them, but everything that feels immediate and dire to us as humans today will one day be boring history for people in museums, or for not necessarily boring, but for historians and people who like history to try to animate and understand. And as you go through the collections in the museum and the Smithsonian, you can see some objects really hold on to the heat of the moment, and some it's hard to imagine what they were so worked up about, and I don't know. This is very fatalistic, and it's not very useful day to day or in individual lives. But the idea that everything we're experiencing now is history, is slowly becoming this history and kind of losing its heat over time, that gives me a sense of the force that's actually ongoing and won't end, which is this kind of ongoing story of human history, basically. That's not really a hope. It's not good or bad. It's kind of neutral. I guess what I would hope is that the forms of public engagement and caring about politics that we've seen, there's actually a beneficial thing we've seen, which is that people are so much more engaged in their political system than they were 50 years ago by almost any metric. Some of that I hope we can see in the museum in the future. I hope people keep protesting. I hope people keep turning out. I hope people, in a way, outrage is better than cynicism. And I hope people stay more outraged and engaged than they do cynical and not engaged at all.
I love that. Now, you had an article. I'm just going to shift gears from your book really quickly, because you had an article that you recently wrote about what America could look like in 2086. And it was a very sobering reality and picture that you paint, specifically when you talk about the QAnon shaman possibly one day standing as a statue next to George Washington. I about fell out of my chair when I read that. But in that article, you talk about that at some point, the history we're living through will be someone's homework in history class. And so when we talk about 200 years from now, that will be the truth. And if you could just talk a little bit about that, and maybe how do we handle that? Because right now everything is so inflamed in society and in the climate of politics.
Yeah, I wrote that article with my colleague, Peter Mancuso at the museum. And we started with this image of, as you say, the QAnon shaman with the horns and the vest and everything standing in the Capitol, a statue of him. And it's true that Jefferson Davis, who president of the Confederacy, led a traitorous secessionist movement, killed hundreds of thousands of American soldiers, fought against the U.S. Constitution, did more damage to the United States than any other individual, well, Robert E. Lee, but was participating in this horrible rebellion, was memorialized in the Capitol within 60 years. So it's not impossible to imagine what the people did on January 6th, which is not even of that scale, will one day be viewed in a different light. And people are out working today to memorialize those people or let them off the hook. There are two ways of looking at this. One is our values will change over time, and maybe people we like today will be sinners in the future, and people we hate today will be heroes in the future. And that you can see throughout American history. Figures like John Brown, who launched a movement against slavery. I mean, people hated him. Some people still hate him, but some people kind of admire him for standing up. People like Frederick Douglass, who were hated and cursed by most Americans in the 19th centuries. He's become one of our greatest heroes. So there's that flexibility of like morals will change. And then there's what I was saying earlier, that everything will cool. Every traumatic thing we experience will one day be taught in some middle school history class, teaching students to memorize what happened on January 6th or the 2020 election. And you can see that in our objects at the Smithsonian. There are these incredible objects from the Civil War. It's from this kind of most dire moment in American history and what's at stake. But the objects have lost that heat, and they seem kind of cool and a little hard to empathize with just what people were going through at the time. So that, I know a little bit that can sound like an opiate or a way to calm ourselves, that all this will pass one day and we'll all be dead or whatever. But it is important to know that history is this moving force. It's bigger than us all. And that sense of perspective, I think it can help us be better actors in the present, because it makes us less heated and less frantic, and helps us maybe make better decisions in the present as well as the future.
It definitely puts things into perspective when you think about that, right? You kind of think about in 100 years from now, in 50 years, it's going to be totally different. As you said, there'll be some poor kid in history class having to learn about, the Civil War and January 6th and all of these things. I've seen a meme about a kid having to read about 2020 to 2022 American history and just crying because there's so much to cover. But, as a political curator, you've talked about how you get to gather items to be preserved in the Smithsonian, which sounds like a really cool job, in my opinion. And I already think I have a pretty cool job. So if I think your job is really cool, that should say something.
We can trade.
Let's do it. For one day, we'll just trade for 24 hours. I'll go to the Smithsonian. You can come work at Renew America Movement.
I can crash your whole organization in 24 hours.
Challenge accepted. So in the wake of January 6th, you asked one of our renewers, Representative Andy Kim from New Jersey, to donate his suit he wore while sweeping up the Capitol. We recently had Andy Kim on for a RAMChat, and he shared a little bit of the story about how you guys approached him. But I was actually hoping that you would tell us a little bit more on what made you decide to ask him for his suit.
Yeah, I mean, every moment that we try to capture in the American present for history, you have to stop and ask, what are the physical objects you can take? What are the material aspects of the story that you can get your hands on and put in a museum and have behind glass in 100 years? And the attack on the Capitol was so physical and striking that there were the signs, there were the outfits, the outlandish outfits these people used. And we collected a fair amount of that stuff. But to tell the story just from the perspective of the objects of these attackers really kind of sold short the people who experienced it and the people who cleaned up afterwards and survived. There's that thing about kind of looking to the helpers and seeing in every awful event who's standing up to kind of help. And Congressman Kim was a perfect example of that story. The way he took a really kind of humble act of cleaning up, while wearing his blue suit and dressed in his fancy congressman's outfit, and got down on the floor and cleaned up the rotunda. It spoke to kind of humility and a really kind of quiet sense of patriotism that was so at odds with the outlandish and violent behavior of people who were claiming to be patriots on the Mall that day, that it really struck us as a way to materially tell this story. And the fact that he also wore the same suit to vote to impeach President Trump a week later, it kind of connected the dots along. And his own personal story, and the fact also that he just a nice guy, fairly moderate politician who can deal with everybody. He seemed like a really good person to try to use to physically tell this story to people in the future. And he was interested. He was happy to help us after we reached out to him. And so we couldn't be happier that we have objects like this to tell the story, and not just from the perspective of those people who are most responsible for it.
I think that's fantastic. Yeah, when we had him on, he talked about how he was approached and he kind of was like, why do you want my J. Crew suit? It's nothing fancy. And so it was really interesting, but I love the fact that you were telling kind of the other side of the story. So now we have a really full picture. For those of you that haven't seen Andy Kim's RAMChat, I encourage you to check it out and obviously watch this one. But Jon, this has been a wonderful conversation. But before I let you go, is there anything else that you're just dying to tell our viewers about?
Speaking of collecting from Andy Kim and his surprise, one of the really interesting things about doing this is nobody goes to any event expecting for their material to be in the Smithsonian, right? And when you go up to somebody at a protest, at a convention, at a rally, and tell them that their object is going in with Lincoln's hat, or ask them if they're interested in that, it's fun, but it's also uplifting to see the present kind of being built into history, and people realizing, the ordinary people realizing the significance of their action, and how they one day, 200 years from now, will help bore school children or whatever. That they're really a part of this history and being incorporated into it. And that's kind of the beauty of what the Smithsonian does as a public institution that exists for the whole American people. So working with Andy and working with anyone we collect from, or just talking to crowds, it's such a pleasure to see how engaged in this moment people are.
Absolutely. Well, this has been fantastic, and we're so excited that you've sat down with us. I'm going to throw it back to Mike, who will close us out.
Yeah, thank you so much, Mary Anna, and thank you, Jon, for coming. I'm going to use a little bit of a host prerogative and just say that I'm very appreciative for what you do with the Smithsonian. It's easy for museums to seem like kind of a collection of kind of tokens from history, and there's just a power in being able to make them tell the story of history that's so fascinating. I always think of I think there's a tree stump in the National History Museum from the Civil War where a tree has just been cut down by musket fire during a battle, and that has always been something that's stuck in my head, because it gives you this thing that has no right being a real spokesman for history. Turns out to give you just such a sense of scale of what that conflict was like. And so, I appreciate what you do, collecting things from our politics to tell that story, giving to the next generations the sense of scale of what we go through every day. It's an incredible responsibility, and I'm sure an honor. But thank you so much for coming today. I'll stop waxing poetic about history, but we appreciate you coming on today. Thank you, Mary Anna, for that great interview. For all of you at home, I hope you enjoyed it. We do these RAMChats regularly, so make sure to stay in touch with us. You can catch our previous RAMChats all stored on our YouTube page, which is youtube.com/Renew America Movement. Follow us at Twitter @Renew America, Facebook @Renew America Movement, and you can sign up on our website to keep all the latest information for everything we're up to at renewamericamovement.com. Please follow along and help us share with your friends. And again, thank you, Jon Grinspan, and thank you, Mary Anna Mancuso, for this delightful conversation.